G'day everyone, Kate here from the Narrate team. This week we begin a brand new series called Samuel. Adam starts in 1 Samuel with the story of Hannah and asks, what if there is a purpose to it?
It's a snowflake, right? So there once was a woman with large calves who was unable to bear children, and her heart was broken, and her future looked bleak. I forgot the scissors. Some men like ride Harleys, some build hot rods. I make paper dolls. It's not actually true, just to be clear. I know you've wondered what I do with all my time. I give you an answer. Look at this. Woo! 1.0, 2.0. Simultaneously, there was a people who had no leader. Their current leader was slipping and no suitable heir could be found. And it's into that gap, into the tension created by that situation, that a man named Samuel steps. And Samuel's story, and even more so his mother, whose name is Hannah, and we'll talk a lot about her this morning, their story collectively, they beg us to ask, I think, one very important question. And that is, what if there's a purpose to your pain? Like, what if sometimes you find purpose by stepping into, not away from the pain? Listen, I know that can sound trite, and it's not my desire to in any way sound trite or to trivialize the pain you may be feeling. I get it. Pain is always undesirable. We would love to avoid pain, and the scriptures would suggest God would love that for us as well. And it's also not to suggest to try to give some kind of spiritual answer as to why the pain, where it came from, who did it, how it happened. That's not really my interest this morning. I think there's a place for that conversation, but I'm not trying to place blame on God. I'm not trying to take it away from him. I'm not trying to place it on you or take it away from you. But if we can allow that pain is almost always undesirable, that it's incredibly uncomfortable, that the human experience is we don't like it, could we also allow that there are times in which we find our purpose via our pain? Like in our culture, we love the conversation about purpose, don't we? We love to read books about purpose. We love talks on purpose. We love podcasts on purpose. We go to seminars about purpose. Our employers send us to things that are all about purpose. And generally those conversations start with, if failure wasn't an option, what would you do? Or they start with, if money were no issue, what would you do? And I think we can all agree those things can be incredibly valuable. To a person, to a professional, to an artist, they have incredible value. And maybe you're someone that you're living right in the middle of that. That's great. But there's another part to that story, isn't there? Like sometimes the bottom falls out. Sometimes the dream goes off the rails. Sometimes something happens that didn't show up on the Post-it note timeline and it didn't make the workbook of the Dream a Dream class. And if you're not careful, it causes you to come to the conclusion that any hope you had for a purpose has been ruined. And I guess the story that we're going to look at for the next few weeks, and the question that I'm going to beg us to consider is, what if sometimes the pain is holding inside of it? What if the purpose is oftentimes embedded inside the pain, and the way you get at the purpose is you stop running from the pain? I was thinking about this in my own life this week, and if this is a regular occurrence for you to be a part of Narrate, then you'll know that I've talked pretty openly over the last couple of years about the fact that in hindsight, I've struggled with anxiety for 36 years. And assuming that's how old I am, that's how long I've struggled with it. Now, I haven't had that title. I didn't know that was the kind of title you would put on my struggles until the last couple of years. But it's been there. And I'm not really interested anymore in the nature versus nurture and which part of it is a result of me and which part of it was just a part of my DNA. It's kind of beside the point to me. And at 17 years old, I was taken to a great church and there began to hear of a Jesus who could help put my life back on the rails. I couldn't quantify it, but clearly I wasn't able to manage my own life. At 19, I said yes to that Jesus. And over the course of the next, 15 years or so, I was blessed. I was served in uncountable ways by the way the church and great sermons and leadership books and discipleship classes and all the many things that hopefully places like this and other great churches offer that they can do for us. But it was a couple years ago when long after grad school and all those kind of hoity-toity intellectual things had happened, it became more and more apparent to me that there was a type of help that was available that the church doesn't always promote, and that well-intentioned pastors armed with great intentions of a Bible verse, things that can be so helpful that they don't always touch on. Because oftentimes we're terrified of the word therapy. We're terrified as a church of how in the world does psychology and the Bible mingle together. And it was then that I stepped into the therapeutic psychological world. And most of the people that I chose to trust were in fact people who love God and follow Jesus. But make no mistake, they weren't counselors. They were full-on trained psychotherapists who had all the tools at their disposal. And over the course of a couple years, they taught me a lot. Now, the bad news is, part of what they taught me is the problem never goes away. It's something to be managed, not run from. But I was thinking this week, and at the risk of putting myself on a pedestal, which wouldn't be my intention, but rather it would be to just illustrate how sometimes pain leads us into our purpose, I was thinking this week that it was a result of that, and my getting comfortable with that whole world and trusting that whole world, that's what led us to be a place where, as a church, a couple times a week, myself or the staff, at minimum a couple times a week, are referring people to a local therapist, a therapist who follows Jesus, who is a part of her own local church in town, but not this one. That's part of what makes it work so well. But again, she's not a counselor. She's a psychotherapist. She has the tools. And I couldn't tell you, because it would be in many ways betraying their confidence, how many people who have done the work, some for a long time, some they just needed a few sessions, and the result of which have grown tremendously. And you know what? Not a single one that I can point to have been drawn away from Jesus or the church. They've only been pushed closer. And for me, as I wrestle with the story of Hannah and everything we're going to get into, and the question of what if pain is oftentimes holding purpose, all of that is my illustration for myself. That were it not for my own issues with anxiety, we wouldn't be a church who are referring people to a type of help that, quite frankly, I don't have the training to offer. And I think we serve our community well when we break down those false divides between quote-unquote church and those professionals who have those tools. So let me ask you again, what if the pain you may be running from, the pain you may be stuffing, the pain you may be hiding, the pain you thought that made it so you couldn't follow Jesus, the pain you thought it was your requirement to just not talk about, what if in your search for purpose, your pain is your answer? In the last couple months, the boys and I, Teresa and I, have been in lots and lots of conversations with our boys. We have 3 about their need for a hobby. They brought it up, not us. And it kind of came out of nowhere. Like all of a sudden they're coming home going, Mom, Dad, I need a hobby. And they had all these ideas about hobbies, and some of them were good ideas and some of them weren't. And the result of which was, I don't know where it came from, I guess. I'm not entirely sure. Teresa and I both have hobbies, I guess. We don't call them that. That's not the vocabulary we use. But yeah, there's things we do that we're not good enough to have anyone pay us to do them, but that somehow contribute to life and energy and making all the things all the more enjoyable and all those different things. And let's just be clear, Teresa has way more hobbies than I do, and they're way more expensive. So if we could just be clear on that one, because that's the way it goes in marriage, right? It's always the wife with all the expensive hobbies. Anyway, the boys are like, hey, we need a hobby. And maybe that's why, because we have them. And so it's been fun. Like it's resulted in lots of conversations and lots of times on the internet and lots of times on Amazon and even trips to Ben Franklin, where my, very masculine hobby is highlighted, of paper dolls. And we've been to the library and checked out books, and there's been lots of things that have happened as a result. But this week, as I was trying to put my brain around, okay, Lord, how do we package this question in a way that, is heard? I couldn't help but think, I wonder if an 11-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 9-year-old, I wonder if them searching for a hobby is about way more than a hobby. I wonder if it's the first signs of a desire for identity. I wonder if it's like a sprout just coming up out of the garden. I wonder if it's the first inkling of that part embedded in all of us, I think, by God that says 7 billion people on the planet. Why does my life matter? What is the unique thing I can contribute to my world that no one else can? I wonder if what we're seeing is that part of us that goes, and we just have to manage the tension between what is blatant self-absorption versus just this authentic, God-given desire to contribute and to matter and to know that if we were pulled out of the equation, something would be missing. And again, there is a way of discovering purpose that's all about the resource, all about the risk, all about the what would you do. But what if pain is also a way to get there? That, I think, is the question that Hannah pushes us toward, and that's where I'd like to go this morning as we embark on this short study of 1 Samuel as we head up toward Easter. Now, let me just say, we talk a lot around here about chair time, which is just our way of saying there's something central to your wiring that this life seems to work better when you start your day with 15 minutes of solitude and silence, and for a Christ follower with scripture and prayer and reflection, whatever that looks like. And if you're someone that's like, I don't know what to read, I don't know what to think about, I would just beg you to think about 1 Samuel, to consider reading 1 Samuel again. It is, in my opinion, one of the most fascinating books, filled with some of the best characters in the entire Bible. And if you're someone that thinks, I can't read the Bible because I don't even know if I believe in God, all the better. Because the stories are full of broken people who God reminds that it's not about them nailing it, it's about his grace. So let's just jump in. We're only going to get through the first 2 chapters anyway, so you can't count on me to take you through a book, because I'm just not, that was supposed to be funny, but Lori thought it was funny. So here we go. Let's just demonstrate how accessible Samuel is. There was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. See, like, how easy is that? I mean, you just go apply that to your life. It's perfect, right? Yes, that was English. No, the whole thing doesn't read like that. He had 2 wives. No, that's not a good idea. One was called Hannah, and the other Peninnah. Now, whenever I think of Peninnah, whenever I see that, I think of pastry. I don't know why. I don't even eat pastries, but or Panera bread. So let's just call her Panera. Panera had children, but Hannah had none. See, the stage is set for a story of 2 women, one of whom story is pretty familiar to the biblical narrative. It's a story of a woman who couldn't have kids. And as this story goes, what you have are 2 sister wives, essentially, who one is providing for her husband lots and lots and lots of kids, both boys and girls, and the other is providing none. And that, of course, in their culture is a very painful scenario. And the other, what makes it all the more complicated, is Miss Panera Bread. She loves to point out to Hannah that she can't provide any kids. And in fact, on an annual basis, their Christmas celebration, it wasn't Christmas, but that's the closest thing we get to culturally, like when they would go up and celebrate and think about God and his purposes for their lives and reset their life and worship and be with family and party and all those things, when they would do that, it would get worse for Hannah, because Panera would use that as opportunity all the more to point out this terrible pain in her life, and that was that she couldn't have children. See, some of you, this is your experience with Christmas. Part of the trick of celebrating something like Christmas or Mother's Day or Father's Day is the fact that what is for some a very festive day filled with things to celebrate is for others a very painful day. And sometimes that's seasonal, sometimes that stays for a few years, sometimes it lasts for a lifetime. And so what you had in these 2 sister wives are 2 people whose experience of this festival couldn't be more different. The story continues. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Panera and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. Now maybe we can just park there. Because one of the questions that stands out to me is, like, did the Lord close her womb? Like, was that really what happened? Or was that Hannah's understanding of the situation? Was that the author's understanding of the situation? Was it Panera's understanding of the situation? Like, have you noticed that all pain has to be interpreted, and that all pain begs for people to offer their opinion as to where it came from. Have you noticed that? All pain, it has to be interpreted, because all pain, it has to be explained, doesn't it? Maybe you've had the experience of people trying to give explanation to your pain in a way that you weren't even asking for. In fact, there's a whole book in the Bible. It's about a guy named Job who goes through unspeakable pain, but the story is really less about his pain and more about the human struggle and absolute demand to have an explanation for pain. And part of the tragedy of the story, and yet the timelessness of the story, is the fact that all his friends are offering insight as to why the pain happened, and he didn't even ask for it. And it wasn't even accurate. All pain, it demands an explanation. See, Hannah's pain was she couldn't have kids. Now, in our culture, that sounds very chauvinistic, and I guess the only thing I could say to you is before you judge the text that way, you always have to judge the text treatment of women against the way the surrounding culture treated women, and time after time, it's always better. Not ideal, but always better. And in Hannah's day, for a woman to not be able to give her husband children was for a woman to be divorced, for a woman to be undesirable, for a woman to be thrown out on her street, on her head. It's a little bit dark, but for a woman, a wife who couldn't provide kids was no different than a chicken that couldn't provide eggs. It just had no place. And in most cases, it led to quick divorce, and then the woman could never remarry because she couldn't have kids, so nobody wanted them. Because see, kids in this culture, they weren't just about a fun time and someone to ski with. Kids were how you lived. This wasn't a cash economy. This was an agricultural economy. And so a kid, a family was what made life sustainable. And when you aged out and your body was breaking down, you needed kids to take care of you. Hannah couldn't provide any. The normal circumstance would be she'd be kicked out, and she would be relegated to a life of prostitution because they can't work the fields and they can't own stuff. And so the only thing she could do was sell herself to eke out, a meager existence. That was her situation. Making matters even more complicated was that to not have kids had spiritual implications. See, to not have kids, the general assumption was that women who couldn't have kids were being smited by God, that there was something wrong with them, and if they would just deal with their sin, then they would be able to have kids again. And so a woman who couldn't have kids, who became a prostitute, became a self-fulfilling prophecy, but because the general thinking in the first place was a woman who couldn't have kids was immoral because there was something she wasn't dealing with. Incredibly painful was her situation. And her sister wife, the text says, that she was so quick, this Miss Panera, to point it out, that every time they went up to the temple to celebrate, Penina, whatever her name is, she would turn up the dial and she would just poke at her, point it out to her, rub her, like, why are you going to the temple? God hates you. What do you mean he hates me? You can't have kids. And it would get so bad, the text says, year after year, before the actual eating happened, before the festival happened, Hannah would run out the door, distraught and emotional and unable to eat. It was like a middle school dance. Just running out. Those boys are so mean. She'd just leave the place. One year the story changed. One year Hannah did something different. Once, when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. Now, if I could just be honest, that's never made sense to me. I've always had this sense of what? And that feels too superficial. It feels too perfect. Suddenly I'm questioning whether or not Hannah could even, it doesn't, her need was for a son. Now you're saying that she's going to give him back? What good would that do? What would that accomplish? And in fact, culturally, it's a fair question. Because part of what God had directed Israel from was a more normal cultural practice, and that normal cultural practice was the firstborn son belonged to the gods. In many cases, in some cases, in most cases, that son belonged to the gods as a sacrifice. In some cultures, he was sacrificed instantaneously. In other cultures, he was just marked. And the priests, the temple workers, they could come get him at 6 months or 6 years or 16 years and offer him as sacrifice to the gods. Some would say what kicked the redemptive story of Israel into gear was God's disgust with that practice. In other cultures, even when they didn't sacrifice the son still belonged to the priesthood. He belonged to the temple. That's how you kept the machine rolling. It's like, we don't need you to sign up for setup because we're just going to take your first son and he'll have to do it perpetually for the rest of his life. It's kind of how it worked. That was supposed to be funny. You guys don't think it's funny. It's because you don't even know what setup is, because this is 11:30. Okay, let's go tear down. We don't have to ask for tear down people because, okay, you get the point. See, the point is here, God went, no, we're not doing that. Instead, God said, I'm going to set aside one of the tribes, one of the 12 sons of Israel's family. They will serve the priesthood. That'll be their vocation. That'll be their purpose. They'll do it. You keep your firstborn. Hannah comes along and goes, God, I'm going to break the system. You can have my firstborn. And I go, well, what sense does that make? It makes none. Until, and here's where it gets personal for me, and I step into the world of interpretation, but I give it for your consideration. I wonder. See, it doesn't make any sense until you go, hey, once there was a woman unable to bear children, her heart was broken and her future looked bleak. Simultaneously, there was a people. That people lacked a leader. The current leader was slipping and no suitable replacement could be found. Listen to this verse in chapter 2, verse 12. Eli's sons were scoundrels. That's the heir apparent. Those are the guys going to take over the temple. They were scoundrels. They had no regard for the Lord. See, once there was a woman who had no son, and therefore she had no future, and simultaneously there was a God who had no leader. And therefore, his future too was in question. Now, before you play that, but he's God card, that doesn't seem to be the way he goes. See, I wonder if part of what happened here was Hannah, in the process of pouring her heart out to God, in the process of weeping and wailing and telling God how terrible her situation was and how broken she was and how ruined her life was and how much she wasn't going to have a future, because when she was an old woman, there wouldn't be any kids who could take care of her. I wonder if in the midst of that, maybe she overheard these scoundrels doing their business in backwards fashion, something we'll talk more about next week. Maybe she just witnessed that this temple thing that was supposed to be beautiful and represented God was way off the rails. And maybe in the process she went, wait a minute. God, you have the same problem I do. I have no son. You have no leader. I wonder if in the midst of Hannah talking to God about her problems, pouring her heart out to God with regard to her problems, I wonder if God went, hey, Hannah, guess what? My situation's just like yours. I'm grieving the lack of a leader as well. I'm grieving the lack of a future as well. I also am not sure where this thing is headed. Hey, Hannah, how about we unite your pain with my purpose? How about we do that? Now, I don't know if that's what caused her to do that, but I do know that the function of what happened, that's exactly what happened. That when you zoom out and you look at Samuel's life, and if you read 1 Samuel, you'll see he was an amazing character, and he stepped into a void that was absolutely crucial at this point in Israel's history. He's a fascinating man, and while most of the heroes in the Bible are these broken people, part of what's crazy about Samuel is he's almost too perfect. But his whole existence is made possible by a woman who found purpose in her pain. And I guess it gets me to that question. What if your pain is of divine design? Not in the sense that he created it, and certainly not in the sense that he desires it. The text tells us he doesn't desire it for you. But in the sense that he can leverage it. And just because you're divorced now, or just because you're a single parent now, or just because you got fired from your first 3 dream jobs, or just because you got caught, or just because you've got an addiction, doesn't mean your opportunity for purpose is gone. Because God oftentimes allows people to find their purpose in the midst of their pain. What if? I got a text message about a month ago from a guy, and just to be clear, I asked their permission to share this story. And it was a guy who I knew of him more than I knew him, and likewise, they're a family that attend here periodically. And it was the type of text message that was pretty clear that the things were desperate and he wanted to meet. And so I think it was the next day, he and I sat down for lunch at the Windbag. And immediately I was sitting across from this very big collegiate athlete, man's man kind of guy, and there were tears in his eyes from the word go. And what he began to share was that the wheels had completely fallen off his marriage. He wasn't sure if his wife was willing to work on it anymore. And what made it all the more interesting was he made it very clear that there were no new problems. They were the same problems they'd had since college, but his wife had had it. And he wasn't sure that she was willing to give him another chance. Now, to his credit, he got serious. He'd been to his doctor to check into some medical situations. He'd given up his evening beer for the foreseeable future, lest that be an issue. He had started going to the gym and working out. He was reading some books about personal growth. And here he was sitting across from me, and he's not a Christ follower. He's very open about that. She was raised in church, follows Jesus. He was not, does not. And he was looking at me going, can you help me? Now, one of the first things I tried to explain to him was, dude, this is a 20-something couple with 2 little kids, not in school, both have new careers, just bought a house. And part of what I looked at him and said, dude, I could give your variables to any young couple, and they'll reproduce your struggles. Like my wife and I did, like most couples I know, like you're at a very predictable intersection. Doesn't make it hurt less, but it's predictable. And quite frankly, your desire to reach out and get help, that's unique. And so he said, so what do I do? And that's when I went into my, well, you should see a therapist speech. I don't get any, what is that called? Commission on it, none of that. And I just said, like, you should go see this gal. And he said, well, I'd love to. He said, but my wife won't. I don't think she'll do anything. And then he said, but, because they attend here periodically, but I'll bet you if you talk to her, I'll bet you can talk her into it. I went, oh, this sounds great. So I had this no-pressure meeting scheduled for a week later where basically the general idea was if I could talk her into therapy, their marriage would be saved and their girls would grow up with their mom, and if I couldn't, they wouldn't. Just kidding. But that's the way it felt. They walked in the door. First thing he said was, hey, we got a meeting with that gal tomorrow. And I was like, oh, sweet. Well, let's talk about football. I mean, it's free agency season. What else are we going to talk about? He said, what I did is we started just talking, and I started hearing her story from her perspective, and to his credit, it was very similar. It was basically the same story. And so as I was listening to the details, I was encouraging them in similar ways. It became pretty apparent that for her, the terrifying fear was pretty simple. It was the fear that she was going to be like her mom. She said, my mom has been married to my dad for her entire life, for her entire adult life. It's never been good. She's always been miserable, and she's just stayed in it, and I'm not willing to do that. I'm not willing to waste my life in a marriage just because I'm that afraid of the word divorce. And basically what she said was, I've wasted my 20s. I'm not willing to waste my 30s. And my fear is that if I go work on this thing and I work on it hard, in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, I'm still stuck in the same miserable marriage because he reverts to his old practices. And at that point, I won't have just wasted my 20s. I'll have wasted my 20s and my 30s. I'm sure none of you can relate to that fear, so I'll try to find a story that you can relate to. You guys are tough. Wow, there's like, get a juggling hat. So I just looked at her. Because what do you say to that? That's as legitimate as any fear I've ever heard. And it could happen. We've all committed ourselves to change and then reverted. It's more normal than it is not. And the only thing I could say to her was, I said, I can't tell you that won't happen, but what if you do the work? And what if in the process of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years, you arrive at a place where you have a great marriage? Not a perfect one because they don't exist. Not an easy one because everything worthwhile takes effort. But what if 5 years from now, you have a great marriage? And what if at that point, remember how I said, like, give anybody those variables and they'll have the same struggles? And that's what happens when our kids are little. It's devastatingly hard. And then we forget, and we were like looking at our friends who have little kids going, what are you doing? This is so easy. So what if 5 years from now, what if 5 years from now, your story can serve another couple? And I'm not kidding. She sat up more straight in her seat. It was pretty obvious I hadn't reached her to this point. I mean, she had that somewhat like, you're a pastor and I've heard your story so many times. And after I suggested, what if God could use your story to serve people? She sat up straight and she looked at me and she said, I had never considered that my pain was something God could use. I'd never considered that God could allow me to serve people by leveraging my painful story. That's my question for you. What if What if we need you to not stuff your pain? What if we need you to not hide from it? Not live ashamed of it anymore? What if we need you to accept God's forgiveness for that divorce or those 2 divorces or that decision or that time you went to jail or that addiction you've had to work on? What if we need you to stop running from the pain and to step into it and to allow God to help you get well? What if we need you to get well, not just for your sake, but for the sake of your community, for the sake of Helena, for the sake of this valley? What if your story's not derailed because the perfect little way that you laid it out your freshman year of college hasn't worked out and now you feel like you're just a peon who's supposed to get through life? What if that's not true? What if some of the most profound purposes out there are born of pain? Listen to Andy Stanley at a conference called Catalyst this last fall. And he started it after some introductory quotes or introductory remarks by just saying, I just have 2 questions for you today. He said, who are you and what breaks your heart? Who are you and what breaks your heart? And of course, I did instantly what you've done, I'm sure, where you just start running and going, yeah, what breaks my heart? What breaks my heart? And for me, it becomes very clear very quickly. Like, what breaks my heart is churches that are all about the tell and not about the ask. Churches that are all about the boxes and not about the freedom that is found in Christ. What breaks my heart is a brand of spirituality that presents itself as knowing everything and being against things like science. What breaks my heart is churches that exist for churched people and that steer themselves deeper and deeper into a tunnel that's all about keeping church people happy. What breaks my heart is the people that we work with and in this community who have long ago disregarded Jesus because they think it's about a religion, and what they don't know is Jesus is the best life coach who's ever lived. He's the best therapist who's ever lived. That to believe in him as God isn't to simply believe in a God who will give you some kind of pass when you die, but that he'll unpack for you the very best way to live. Who are you? And what breaks your heart? And what if your pain is where you find your purpose? What if your purpose is embedded inside of your pain? You know, I think it's important to remember that as you may consider following a Jesus who claims to be God, that his purpose was very much found in his pain. In the Gospel of John, I've been doing some research on Jesus' feelings and when he felt. We're going to do a series this summer called Help, I Feel. Because wouldn't life be easier if you just didn't? But what I've discovered is that John in particular lets us into a window of Jesus' emotional world that the other gospel writers don't. And one of those places is found in John chapter 12, where we're familiar with what Jesus felt in Gethsemane before his arrest, but John lets us into some things that happened for Jesus before those things even happened. It's in chapter 12. It says, "Now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say?" Now that word troubled there, part of what I've been learning, it means shaken up. It could be translated in the message anxiety. Like Jesus was filled with anxiety. His palms were sweaty. His heart was racing. His stomach was upside down, if you know what I mean. Like, where's the Pepto was his move. Like, things were going crazy and he just wanted to run. My heart's troubled. What shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? Shall I run from my pain? No, it's for this reason that I came to this hour. See, the cross is this vivid reminder, isn't it? That sometimes our greatest purpose, we find it by stepping into our pain. Listen, I don't know how you're hurting. I don't even know if you're hurting. But I know at the very least you have hurt. What if you stepped into it? What if you stopped looking for the storybook version of purpose? What if your pain, your forgiveness, your wellness could be the story that could help the next alcoholic, the next person going through a divorce, the next whatever? What if God could use it? What if he could? See, once there was a woman who could bear no children. Her heart was broken and her future looked bleak. Simultaneously, there was a people who needed a leader. And God wasn't sure where he was going to find that leader. And into that gap steps a man named Samuel, a man whose story begs us to consider the purpose of our pain. And though it's undesirable, maybe it's more usable than anything else. Let me pray for you. God, I'm praying in particular for people who there's nothing trivial about their pain, whether it's the pain of cancer or the pain of a failed relationship or the pain of a mortgage that can't be paid. Even the pain of couples who are going, I am that woman and now I'm 50 and I've wasted 20 years of my life. God, I know you're not trite and your attitude's never to be trivial. Would you move close to them in the way that only you can through your Holy Spirit? Would you give them the wisdom to know what to do and the courage to do it? And God, for those of us who we just get sucked into this church trap that says, zip yourself up and look perfect because that's the MO. God, would you remind us that it's in our weakness that you're most beautiful? Would you remind us that it's by grace, not because we've nailed it? And Jesus, as we look to this song and are reminded that you stepped into your pain, may we see that, may we receive the gift of relationship with you that the cross and the resurrection brings about. And may we grab tightly hold of it as inspiration to allow you to do similar things with our pain. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.